Okay, guys, looks like most of us are here, so let's just get started. So obviously on Thursday and Friday, we were looking at the civil rights movement. We specifically were looking at how African Americans got more equality after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We saw how segregation ended, but I try to make it clear that the civil rights movement went just beyond that. There was also a focus on women and a focus on the environment. So today we're going to look at those two particular movements. Today is a double period Monday, so your second period will focus on the Supreme Court aspect. There's some very famous civil rights Supreme Court cases that you guys are gonna have to focus in on. So make sure you have your Supreme Court graphic organizer for that. All right. So focus question for today is: what other civil rights movements made an impact throughout the 1950s and 60s? Tristan, I see you in the seventh period, so I'll see you at like 12:38. I think you're early. All right. All right. Okay. So let's first focus on the feminist movement slash, the women's rights movement, though it's not really called the women's rights movement anymore. It's more called the feminist movement, especially when you get to wave 2 of the women's rights movement. So wave 1, we should remember, that was the push for the women's right to vote, going all the way back to Seneca Falls, and then eventually the 19th Amendment. That's review. That should be understood by this point already. Okay? Wave 2 is going to be more of a focus on getting equal job opportunities, equal pay, and equal education for women. So let me try and spell out a little bit of a reality after the 19th Amendment. Women did have the right to vote. Women were still kind of looked at as a lesser person when it came to the workforce and when it came to education. That's not to say that they weren't given opportunities, but it was few and far between. So this is really going to be a focus and push for equal job opportunities, making sure women can get kind of whatever job they want. In some of the higher echelon places, there wasn't a lot of women doctors. There wasn't a lot of women lawyers. There wasn't a lot of women in government. So this was a push to kind of get that. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 goes into a lot of things for African Americans, but also starts pushing things for women. One of the biggest things is going to be something known as Title IX. I know it's written as Title IX, but that is just a Roman numeral. So it's going to be something that's going to be related to helping women get certain equality. And Title IX specifically centered around education. Okay, so I know it's very tough to see, but if you simplify Title IX, the Education Amendment of 1972 was designed to limit discrimination by sex and sexual harassment in public schools and other government-funded institutions. So it's helping make sure women aren't sexually harassed and paid less, or making sure they get in the right jobs. Schools are also prohibited from restricting admission or participation in activities based on if they're male or female. So let's say there's a basketball team, a boys basketball team in the school. It's a silly example, but this is the truth. If there's a boys basketball team in the school, you need to have a girls basketball team as well. If there's not enough women for a girls basketball team, that's fine. You don't have to have a team, but if there's enough interest, you need to kind of do it, okay? So this is known as Title IX. This was a big thing in the Civil Rights Act that was passed. If you go against Title IX at any point, if you don't try and have equality for women in hiring or in education, that's a huge, huge problem. All right, that's going to lead to consequences, and these programs like colleges and schools could lose their funding. So like, let's say at PS 89, we didn't allow women to take the Regents class, let's say, something stupid like that. If the government found out about that, our school would be fined, consequences would be given, and our school could be shut down if we had something like that. That's going against Title IX. That's from the Civil Rights Act. All right, so this just ensures equality of opportunity for women, because before this, it really was not the way it should be. So this was a huge focus in Wave 2, and this is the focus for today. We'll touch a little bit on wave 3 and wave 4 a little bit later, but this is wave 2 in the focus for today. All right, so let's look at one of the most famous feminist icons of wave 2, named Betty Friedan. Does anyone remember who the most famous feminist icons was for the wave 1? It's like 2, but 1 for sure. Who remembers from wave 1 the most famous women icon of the first feminist movement?
Is it Susan B. Anthony?
Correct.
Oh, the chat says unavailable for me.
The chat is unavailable?
Yes,
Yeah.
that isn't available at this time.
Try that. Does it work now?
Yes.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, my fault, guys. So I think I actually just clicked the button by accident. So thank you for clearing that up. All right. So let's look at Betty Friedan. She's really, I mean, are there more? Absolutely. But she's the biggest one from wave 2. So let's take a look at her and see why Betty Friedan was a huge woman for the second women's rights movement. Okay. So Betty Friedan was known for writing this book called The Feminine Mystique. And this book had an interesting argument that many women after World War II were simply unhappy. So if you go back, you know, a lot of women went into the nursing field, they went to work in factories, and when those wars ended, they kind of went back to the quote-unquote typical housewife, you know, back at home, not working, raising kids, things along those lines. And if you're someone who wants to do that when you grow up, that is completely fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Betty Friedan's argument was that women were not living fulfilled lives when they just, quote unquote, wanted to grow up and raise a family and be a mother and be a wife. Some would agree, some would disagree. So her argument was that many women were unfulfilled because many women didn't have those aspirations for those higher paying jobs and higher career choices throughout this time. Many women were not high officials in government and, you know, weren't big business leaders, okay, or big in the education field. So she created an organization called NOW, which is known as the National Organization for Women, which helped women gain equal rights in jobs, pay, education, and a big one, underrated, is maternity leave. You know, what happens when someone who's working, a mother, gives birth. Now they need some time off. What's going to go on? Thanks to this book and Betty Friedan, she was a huge advocate for something getting called the Equal Pay Act passed. And this comes in 1963, just before the Civil Rights Act, but ultimately is very simple. It required, regardless of gender, people in the same job with the same education get paid the same. So back in the 1940s, back in the 1950s, there used to be a true wage gap. So if a man worked a job and a woman worked a job, very often, not all the time, very often, a woman would get paid less for doing the same job. This is known as the gender wage gap. This was a problem in American history. After 1963, that's not something that should be occurring anymore. Okay? So it required, regardless of gender, people in the same job with the same education get paid the same. Okay? So a great example is myself and Miss Sharetta. I work a job. We have the same education. We've been working pretty much the same years, so we get paid the same. Okay, it doesn't matter she's male or she's a female, I'm male. It doesn't make a difference. We get paid the same. Okay. Now there's still this kind of idea in 2021 that there is a gender wage gap. There's this. Just give me a yes or a no if you ever heard this statement. For every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 77 cents. Not sure if you ever heard of this statement before. Okay. It's true, but it's also a little bit misleading as well. So I'm going to share with you, this is completely up to you if you want to go a little bit further research with this. There's two viewpoints on it. The viewpoint is there is a wage gap and women do get paid less, because of, gender discrimination, because, women aren't treated the same. And then there's a different view that, yes, women get paid less than men, but not based on like the jobs that they do. It's just if you total up all the jobs men have and the hours they work, and then you take the average, and you take the average of all the jobs women have and the jobs they work, women do make less. But it's not because of any discrimination or women getting paid less. So there are two views on it. One's a video if you want to watch that, and then one is a reading if you want to go a little bit further there. Not telling you guys how to think, but I will say in history this used to be a huge problem that was fixed with the Equal Pay Act. But I will assure you, if you get a job, you're not going to get, if you're a girl in class, you're not going to get paid less when you get a job than the man that you're working with. Well, if you watch Anisia, if you look at the article and you look at the video, they talk about that both. Right? It's just basically averaging all of the money certain groups of people make. When you look at their choices, the careers they have, things along that lines. I mean, like a great example is teaching. Teaching is not a high-paying job. Most people who work in teaching, you haven't noticed, are women. So like that's an example there. One of the highest-paying jobs is petroleum engineering. If you want to be an engineer, that's a field that's like 85% men. So like, women, I guess, if you want to, get more money, try and go into those fields sort of things. So both of those, that article and the YouTube assignment, YouTube, if you want to watch it, are pretty good in just kind of giving both perspectives on it. And then you can kind of determine what you think there. But it's a complicated situation. But for our class, we need to know the Equal Pay Act rectified that issue in American history a little bit. Okay? This is an interesting one. And this is another controversial one that came out in the 1970s towards the end of the Civil Rights Act. Okay, this is known as the Equal Rights Amendment. So take a look at that. Okay, so a big push in the 1970s was passing what's something known as the Equal Rights Amendment, which basically they were trying to do was, I believe it's make the 24th or maybe it's the 25th Amendment. I forget. They're trying to make an amendment, okay, and we'll just say it's the 25th Amendment they're going to call it. Now, I'm going to say right from the start, this amendment never gets passed, okay, and we'll kind of go through what it was. So in the early 1970s, women made a push to ban discrimination against all women. This is, when you read it, very fair thing. You shouldn't discriminate, women for anything or for, anyone for any reason for that matter. But there becomes a little bit of an issue that starts to happen if you pass an amendment like this, okay? Many women and lawmakers in Congress, they thought ratifying this amendment would lead to these problems. And I'm just going to list the problems and kind of show you why the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment, or sometimes known as the ERA, is still sometimes in discussion in current American politics. But let's look at why in the 1970s, the reasons why it didn't pass. So the argument is the 14th Amendment that we learned about through Reconstruction already protects women and all groups from discrimination. If a woman gets discriminated against in the country now, they could use their 14th Amendment privileges to look back at that. The 14th Amendment covers all minority groups. The only kind of interesting thing is there's more women in the United States than men. So they're not technically a minority group. They're actually a majority in the country. But in terms of representation in some jobs, they are considered a minority group. Okay, so many people say the 14th Amendment already protects women from discrimination. The idea would be if you pass a women's discrimination amendment, then you'd have to pass you could pass any group amendment. You'd have to pass an amendment on, let's see, you'd have to do one for gay people. You'd have to do one for transgender people. You would have to do one maybe for Asian Americans. You'd have to do one for Hispanic Americans. Okay, if you open up what's called a can of worms for one group, then you'd have to do amendments for all the groups. So the thought was if you give this amendment for women, then you're going to have to do this for all groups of people, and that means we're going to have to do about another 10 to 15 amendments or more. So they wanted to just say, you're covered under the 14th Amendment. This should protect women from discrimination. Number two, women right now are not currently eligible for drafts and still aren't. This would open them up to become eligible for a draft. And you got to understand, this Equal Rights Amendment was going on at the same time of the Vietnam War, which you haven't learned about yet, but this was something not a lot of women and lawmakers really wanted. Okay, Vietnam War was a very crazy war, and this is something that they didn't want to go through. Abigail, go ahead.
Is it also because if women were eligible to eligible for drafts, there wouldn't be many people working in like the medical industry for this part?
It was that, but also like, okay, who would take care of the kids? Who would take care of the families? Like, what would happen if, the husband and wife got drafted? Now, what are we going to do with the kids? There's a lot of like problems when you start breaking down, if women get drafted. So yes, Abigail, that's true, because we know once these big wars kind of go into effect, women seem to take those nursing and factory jobs, but it goes even further beyond that. Okay. And number three, the traditional family would be harmed. Listen, there's benefits to living in two-parent households. Okay. When two people are around, I know I have a young child at home, and I could see the benefits like of just having two people around certainly helps. So if you quote unquote, make women eligible for drafts, then you could, have the traditional family would be harmed. I think that's one of the weakest arguments. I tend to think the 14th Amendment argument is the best, and that's why the ERA was never ratified. So this is something you could hear debated on the House floor, but ultimately not something that was ever ratified. So we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment for women. They kind of just fall under everything else. Okay, so any group in our country is protected by the 14th Amendment. Okay, plain and simple. Okay, so they didn't make a separate one for that. All right. Last thing we're going to do is we're going to briefly just look at the environmental movement, but the environmental movement is going to really come out a little bit more when you do your assignment. So I'm just going to kind of touch on it, and then your assignment's going to do most of the work with it. So this is the last slide for today. And we're going to look at something called the environmental movement, and another very big book throughout the 1960s that a lot of people liked. So let's take a look. Okay, so I'm oversimplifying this, but I can kind of summarize the environmental movement through America through the first 200 years. Environment was not a huge priority, protecting the environment. Besides the environmental president, which if you guys remember, I'll be very impressed. Who was the environmental president that created the national park system in our country? Well, I got a quick hand raise. All right, go ahead.
Wasn't it Theodore Roosevelt?
It was Teddy Roosevelt, yeah. Besides him creating the national parks, he's like known as our conservation president. After that, there's like, it's not a huge focus. And it starts becoming a much bigger focus in the 1960s and still is kind of today. A big reason for that was because of this environmentalist. Her name was Rachel Carson. Okay, that's a picture of her there. She was a scientist too. And she basically made the argument that we need to start focusing on the environment. Otherwise, we're going to harm our planet. And if we harm our planet, that's going to give us a bad place to live. And this book launched the environmental movement throughout the 1960s and still exists today. The environmental movement and climate change and global warming, they all kind of like are related. There are some differences between, some of the different movements. I know when I was growing up in your age, global warming was a big thing. Global warming is not as big of a thing now. They're more worried about climate change. When my parents were growing up, the environmental movement in Silent Spring and was a big thing. All right, so it just kind of depends. So the book had a very big focus on specifically the use of pesticides. Pesticides are these chemicals basically that were being put into the earth, the ground, and this was causing, again, I'm not this big science expert, but this was causing a lot of species to die out or get sick. And what was happening was the natural food chain was beginning to be harmed. So this is maybe even something that Mr. Lardo can go into some more details about. But even though the book was focused on that, it started to raise awareness for us just like taking care of the environment in general. Like maybe you shouldn't be putting chemicals in the ground. Maybe we shouldn't be polluting the air, okay? And from this came a lot of protests and marches. They're called the Earth Day protests, okay? And they wanted to protest for us to have a focus on creating a National Earth Day. And on this day, they wanted to, recognize, better ways and more productive ways of protecting our environment. This book and this movement led to something called the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency that helps focusing on protecting the environment. All right. So this is just a touch on what you're going to do for your assignment very shortly. So you'll get to your assignment, you'll get a little bit more information on that just through the assignment, okay? The last thing I'll say is a big thing that kind of starts but doesn't gain much traction until a little bit later on is the gay and lesbian rights movement. There was definitely more of a recognition in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that, there were gay people, there were lesbian people, okay, and it was becoming a little bit more accepted. but it doesn't really make much success in terms of laws and things along those lines. Those come a little bit later in the 1990s and 2000s. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but that was kind of started throughout the civil rights movement. So ultimately, the civil rights movement, you should really know it as in this order: African Americans, then women, then the environment. And then, of course, there's some smaller successes for different groups at this time too, but that was really the biggest one in that order. Okay, there was some big laws changed, there was some huge changes, getting rid of segregation, getting equal pay for women, getting the EPA and Earth Day. Those were some big, big changes throughout this time, and that's a big thing throughout the civil rights movement. Okay, so before we let you get going with the assignment, I think you'll have about 10 minutes to do it or so. Tomorrow, we stop the civil rights movement and we go back to the Cold War. So hopefully you remember the Cold War, civil rights movement, all happening at the same time. Okay, so you'll go back and do that. All right. In terms of your second period assignment, you're going to have a video you have to watch, a little less than 20 minutes. Take your notes. Most of it's Supreme Court. There's like 4 Supreme Court cases you have to do under a Supreme Court justice. You're going to take a screenshot of your Supreme Court notes, okay, with the new notes there. I forgot to show you the Regents questions that go along with them. So my 2 screenshots here, those are the Regents questions. Okay, what you'll do in the second period, again, this is the second period, you have a matching column. Some of these you already know, like you should already know Brown versus Board of Education or Schenck versus the United States, but you're also learning some new ones today, and I want you to match up. Okay, so it's a good little Supreme Court review. That's what you're doing as well, along with the notes. Okay, with that being said, we're going to do a little bit of DBQ practice. Okay, no essay. Just the documents. You have a total of 3 documents. Okay. Remember our good friend RQ. Restate and quote. Not ELA class. It's social studies class. Okay. You have 3 documents there with 3 questions, and that's all you have to do for your period 1 assignment. Definitely read them. It starts to go into a little bit more of the environmental issues that I didn't really speak on too much because the reading does. All right, so 10 minutes to do it. I think that's plenty of time to get it done, to be honest. So you shouldn't have any more work besides this. I'll be here if you have questions, though.